morning.
Morning.
Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Coastside Community Sunday Service. I am Laurel Frischman, and along with Bill Hevlin, we are your worship associates for today. A very warm welcome to those visiting us for the first time and to our friends joining us over Zoom. However you describe yourself, whomever you love, whatever your age, your abilities, your paths traveled, you are most welcome here. Each of you a miracle in our midst. Here we honor that personal flame that spiritually foster community, endeavor for social justice, and repair this beautiful, perplexing world. Today, this service holds two events. Our featured speaker is Reverend Kalen Fristad with a sermon entitled Universalism, Past, Present, and Powerful. And we celebrate the UU flower ceremony today, first celebrated on June 4th, 1923, exactly 100 years ago today. If you have not yet found a moment to bring a flower to the altar, we'll pause for a second if you want to come on up. Pretty good?
Thank you, Laurel. And now it's time for our chalice lighting, one that unifies us as Unitarian Universalists. This ritual grew out of the refugee crisis of the 1930s. People were fleeing the Nazis in Europe and so on. Like the candle in the logo of Amnesty International, this candle represents hope in the midst of darkness. Now, due to fire regulations, this particular chalice light glows from battery power. Now, our chalice lighting words are the fire of commitment. They come from Paul Sprecher. Please read with me. We light this chalice to kindle a fire of commitment to spread our beloved faith. Proclaim the good news that all are worthy and all are welcome. That God is love and none shall be left behind. May we carry this flame to all who we encounter, letting our lives shine with its glow.
And now, with great pleasure, I introduce Reverend Kalen Fristad. Reverend Kalen Fristad has been a United Methodist minister for over 40 years and is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Christian Fellowship. From 2003 to 2006, he traveled the country full-time with his wife, Kalen, to speak at churches proclaiming the hopeful message of universalism. Then he served churches in Iowa half-time and spent half-time on the road. Retired from parish ministry in 2013, he continues to travel the country speaking on universalism. Over the years, he has spoken to more than 250 UU churches. So we'd like to welcome Reverend Kalen to church number 251. Welcome.
It is indeed a great privilege and pleasure to be with you today. She mentioned maybe it was 251, I don't know what it is. It's somewhere between 255 and 260, I think. I haven't kept close track. But I love UU churches. The diversity is just something wonderful. There are some churches that tolerate diversity. Other churches don't even tolerate diversity, but UU celebrate it. And I celebrate that with you. I think that's one of the things the world needs, perhaps more than anything else, to respect each other and respect diversity and so on. So it is indeed a great pleasure for me to be with you today. When I served the United Methodist Church in Dallas Center, Iowa, I became acquainted with the UU minister in Des Moines. And when she realized that I believed in universalism, she invited me to attend a special service that their church was going to have. It's going to be in the small town of Mitchellville, which is a few miles east of Des Moines, and it would be in a church building that originally housed a Universalist congregation. There was not a congregation there anymore, but that church in Des Moines had one service each Sunday out at that church as a way of celebrating that one church each. I'll get it right. Celebrated one Sunday each summer out of that church in order to celebrate their Universalist heritage. So I was very happy to accept her invitation to join them in that service. And I'll always remember, as I walked up the walk in front of that church, over the door it read, Universalist Church. And I thought, I have arrived at home. Universalism has been really important to me for a long time, and that's why I wrote a book on the subject. And for 20 years now, we've been traveling the country, at least half time, proclaiming the wonderful message of Universalism. Today I'm going to be speaking on the history and the significance of the teaching of Universalism. It is sometimes referred to as universal salvation, so I'd like to offer a definition of salvation that's probably different from what you've heard from other sources. You're probably aware that at least among conservative Christians, their definition of salvation would be to accept Jesus as your personal Savior so you can go to heaven when you die. Well, I believe that's not a very adequate understanding of salvation because it doesn't necessarily involve any change or growth. So a definition I've come up with that works for me is that salvation is to learn and grow either with or without divine influence so as to experience fullness of life in this life and beyond. And if you don't believe in the divine or if you don't believe in life after death, then you can just leave those parts off the definition. And so to me, salvation, the most basic understanding of salvation is that it is to learn and grow so as to experience fullness of life. So in contrast to what a lot of people believe, I reject the idea that a lot of people will spend eternity suffering in hell. Instead, I believe that everyone will eventually experience salvation or fullness of life. And for certain individuals, if that doesn't take place in this lifetime, I believe it will take place sometime beyond. During the time of the early church, the time of Jesus, I should say, it was commonly taught in most of the religions of the day that the vast majority of people would spend eternity suffering in hell. But there was at least one exception to that, and that was the Zoroastrian faith. They were Universalists. Isn't that wonderful? And the Zoroastrian faith was developed in the area of Persia, which is where the current country of Iran is, and they were Universalists, and it was developed in the 5th and 6th centuries before the time of Jesus. And so they were Universalists. But another exception to the general conventional thinking of the day regarding eternal damnation of the vast majority of people was Jesus. That's very obvious from many passages in the Bible that Jesus did not believe in eternal damnation, but he believed in universalism. But in the environment where the conventional thinking was that the vast majority of people would spend eternity suffering in hell, it was sometimes difficult to convince people otherwise. And so there were some people who professed to be followers of Jesus, but at the same time they held on to the belief of the endless suffering of many people beyond death. So my view is that they weren't fully converted to Christianity. But there were an awful lot of those early Christians who did believe in universalism. Indeed, my reading of history tells me that it was the vast majority of the early Christians that did believe in universalism. Clement and Origen of Alexandria were two prominent leaders, two prominent theologians during the time of the early church who believed in universalism. Others included Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and many, many others as well. But as I said, there were some people that weren't fully converted to Christianity. And Tertullian was one example of that. He became a Christian at age 40, and he held on to his belief of endless suffering of many people beyond death. In fact, Tertullian so relished the idea of people, and of course it was other people, not himself. He relished the idea of other people spending eternity in hell. In fact, he so relished the idea that he said he believed that one of the best things about heaven would be the superb view of the damned frying in hell. Doesn't the thought of that just make you feel good all over? Isn't that the most crazy thing you've ever heard? But he believed that, and he said it. You know, sometimes you can think things and believe things, but to say it out loud, that's a whole other matter, and that's what he did.
It takes God and Freud to a new level.
Right. Anyway, so that's what he believed. And so it's such an astonishing thing for a person who professed to be a follower of Jesus, a follower of the one who taught so much about love and peace and forgiveness and so on, could so relish the idea of other people suffering excruciating torment in hell forever. The theologian Augustine was another example of a person who wasn't fully converted. He became a Christian at age 32, and he also held on to the belief of the endless suffering of many people beyond death. But Augustine was a pretty good theologian in many respects, and therefore it's not surprising that his theology started to become dominant in the church. He lived in the latter part of the 4th century and into the 5th century, and so it's not surprising that by the 6th century there was coming to be quite a controversy over the issue of universalism. In order to resolve this controversy, the Roman Emperor Justinian called a church meeting. It was the 5th Ecumenical Council in the year 553. Now, does it seem a little strange to you that a Roman emperor would call a church meeting? Well, it makes perfect sense when you think about the fact that emperors like to control people. Isn't that a given? Emperors like to control people. And the people back then had learned that threatening people with eternal damnation was the foolproof means of controlling them. Of course, that's true yet today of many people. But the problem is, they could threaten those free-spirited universalists with unending hell all they wanted, and they didn't take it seriously. So they weren't able to control them. So the emperor allied himself with the hellraisers of the day, the people who advocated the teaching of unending suffering in hell. And together they pushed through a resolution which abolished the teaching of universalism. Now it's not surprising that with all the power of the church and the state against the teaching, the teaching pretty well died out after that, or at least went underground. And that lasted for a long time, really for about 1,000 years. But you can't suppress the truth indefinitely, right? Eventually it'll start bubbling up someplace. And that's what happened about 300 years ago. It really started more than 300 years ago, but it was about 300 years ago that it started to become a strong movement once again. One example of a group that developed that espoused the teaching of universalism was the Moravians. And they had quite a bit of influence in Europe as well as in the American colonies. The American colonies proved to be quite a fertile ground for the spread of the teaching of universalism. George de Benneville came over from France in 1741. He was a physician, and he did quite a bit to spread the teaching of universalism in eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey and in Maryland. John Murray came over from England in 1770, and he worked closely with the Quakers and the Baptists in spreading the teaching of universalism throughout the American colonies. It was under Murray's leadership that the Universalist Church in America was organized. There were many prominent women leaders in the Universalist Church in America, and Olympia Brown was one of them. And she was the first woman to be ordained by any denomination. Olympia Brown was ordained in 1863. And isn't that wonderful in an era where there's still churches that don't ordain women. But the Universalists began that process in 1863. Now, it's not surprising that the Universalist Church, well, let me back up and say this first. Hosea Ballou was the most prominent leader in the Universalist Church during his life and ministry. And when he died in 1852, the Universalist Church had about 800,000 members. So it was a strong movement, to be sure. But it shouldn't surprise us that they were so successful, and that is because the spirit among the churches in those days was influenced very much by the Puritans, and they were Calvinists, and they believed that most people were going to go to hell, and God was angry, and God was going to throw people into hell. And so in that environment, the Universalists came along with really good news. They said, that's not going to happen at all. And so a lot of people if they started showing inclinations toward believing in Universalism, they'd get expelled from their church. And the Universalists say, well, welcome, come and join us. And so it was a terrible environment, even worse than today. I mean, because we have fundamentalists today and negative stuff and divisiveness. But it was even worse back then with the influence of the Puritans. There was what was called the Great Awakening, which was anything but a Great Awakening. It was just awful, led by Jonathan Edwards and so on. But anyway, the Universalists were very successful. And of course, there were many Universalists who made a lot of difference in the world, including Abraham Lincoln. And he was a Universalist, and he, along with many other Universalists, worked for the freedom of the slaves. Clara Barton was the founder of the American Red Cross. Olympia Brown was not just a minister, but she was an activist and very, very involved, along with many others, in bringing about women's suffrage. So they rose to the challenge and dealt with some really important issues in those days, not just religious issues, but political and social issues. And the need is still very much here yet today for that. The teaching of Universalism hasn't been espoused only by Universalists or Unitarians over the years, but espoused by other leaders and theologians of other denominations as well. For example, there was a German theologian in the 18th century named Friedrich Schleiermacher. I wonder, how many people here have heard of old Friedrich? Okay. That puts you at, I think, slightly above average. I find it might be maybe 2 or 3% at the most that have heard of old Friedrich. But Friedrich Schleiermacher was a fine theologian and a strong advocate of Universalism. Besides that, I just like to say his name. Friedrich Schleiermacher. I love that name. I'm not sure what there is about it, but I think it's pretty cool. Anyway, there were other theologians in the 20th century that taught Universalism: Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Leslie Weatherhead, and many others as well. So the teaching of Universalism has a long, rich history, especially for more than 500 years following the time of Jesus, and then especially in the last 300 years as well. So you might wonder, why is this so important to me as a United Methodist minister? Unfortunately, Universalism is not a part of our heritage. So why would I write a book on the subject, and why would we spend 20 years? That is so cool to think about that. It was 2003 when we started traveling the country, full-time for 3 years, and then half of the time, most of the time since then, talking about Universalism. So why would we do that? Well, obviously it's because I think it's an important issue. It seems to me that the teaching of a God of eternal damnation has prevailed for far too long in most churches and in our society at large, and with devastating consequences. One of the reasons why this is so important to me is because the teaching of a God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. There can be many reasons why people might not believe in God, and I respect that. But one of the reasons why people turn away from God is because of the teaching of a God of eternal damnation. People don't want anything to do with a God like that, not surprisingly. And so the teaching that God threatens, or he throws people into hell and tortures them forever because they were naughty, is literally an insane concept. Have you thought about that? We know what happens when people punish their own children excessively, right? We know what happens to them. They either end up in a mental hospital or in prison. Yet they say that's what God's going to do for eternity. Torture people forever because they were naughty. I mean, give me a break. It is literally an insane concept. And so the teaching of God of eternal damnation turns many people away from God. Sometimes they become atheists. Now, I need to acknowledge that I've learned a lot about atheism from UUs, and I'm grateful. When we went on the road, I knew a little bit about atheism, but I didn't know hardly anything, quite frankly. But one of the high points of speaking at UU churches is I've met a lot of wonderful atheists. I didn't expect that, but what a joy it's been. It's been one of the high points. Of course, I've met a lot of wonderful people of a great variety of faiths in UU churches. But for some, they find atheism to be a thoughtful, responsible, mature way to approach life, and it works for them. For people for whom atheism works, I really don't have a difficulty at all. But in other denominations, when people become atheists, that often is not such a positive thing. And that is because they sometimes still have in the back of their mind the possibility of spending eternity in hell. And if they don't believe that there is a God who can rescue them from that plight, they can sometimes conclude that they are doomed, and that can lead to despair and meaninglessness. We all want to make the world a better place. And that's what motivates me more than anything else to travel the country speaking on universalism. We all want to make the world a better place, but it seems to me that we're not going to have very much success in that regard as long as the teaching of a God of eternal damnation continues to prevail in most churches and in our society at large. And the reason for that is because what people believe about God has a powerful and direct influence on how they live their lives. If people believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel, it's very, very easy for them to justify living that same way themselves. It's like the old song, "One tin soldier" goes, "Go ahead and hate your neighbor. Go ahead and cheat a friend. Do it in the name of heaven. You can justify it in the end." Sadly, I see people in our own country and around the world every day seeking to justify evil behavior in the name of heaven, in the name of God. And it's much easier to do that if we believe that God is judgmental and condemning and cruel. I believe this is of enormous significance. So if we follow God's example of our perception of God as being judgmental and cruel, we'll live that way. But if we believe that God is loving and kind and merciful and gracious and patient, we're more likely to live that way as well. So this is of enormous significance. I believe if we're going to change the world for the better, perhaps the most important single thing that we need to do is to change people's perception of God. From that of being judgmental and cruel to that of loving. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was sometimes criticized because he loved his enemies too much. He was told, "You shouldn't love your enemies, you should seek to destroy them." To which Lincoln replied, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" Isn't that powerful? Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? Abraham Lincoln was a universalist. He believed in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual. And because of that, he could love even his enemies. And what a difference that made in how he lived his life. So it seems to me that we who believe in universalism need to follow the example of Abraham Lincoln. And we who believe in universalism, who believe in the power of love and the preciousness of each individual, are called to rise above being judgmental and cruel in order to be able to transform the world with love. So we who believe in universalism have wonderful good news to share with the world. So it is important, very important that we do so. There was a man named Robert Short who wrote a book called Something to Believe In. And in that book, among many things worth quoting, he says, "There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies." Isn't that a mouthful? There is too much at stake for us to allow ourselves to be intimidated by the wrathful self-righteousness of the hell-raising gloomy doomies. And then he goes on to say, "Therefore, our witness to them should be just as aggressive and unambiguous as theirs has been to us." Fundamentalists can be intimidating, can't they? They go around quoting the Bible and asking people whether or not they're saved. They exhibit such confidence, so they can be intimidating. But I say, let's not be intimidated by them. After all, we are the ones with the good news. They, in contrast, spread a teaching that is divisive and leads to cruel and inhumane behavior and justifies abuse. With the teaching of fundamentalists, it's really no big deal to torture people, whether at Guantanamo Bay or whatever. After all, they believe that God is going to torture people forever because they were sinners or they were naughty or whatever. If it's okay for God to torture people, surely it must be okay for us to do it. Besides, the torture that we might inflict upon others, whether it's waterboarding or whatever, is nothing compared to the torture that they say that God will inflict upon people forever in a literal lake of fire, no less. So we who believe in the power of love, who believe in the preciousness of each individual, who believe in universalism, have a wonderful message to share with the world, and it's so important that we do that. The teaching of a God of eternal damnation leads to wars and racism and oppression and abuse, while the spread of the teaching of universalism leads to equality, respect, love, and dignity for all. So I say, let's not be intimidated. Instead, let us freely and boldly proclaim to the world the wonderful message of universalism, and the world will be infinitely better off because of it. Amen.
Joni Mitchell is one of my favorites and a flower of Canadian folk song. The flower ceremony, also called the flower communion, was the invention of the Czech minister Norbert Čapek. Initially a Baptist minister, In 1921, he and his wife Maya came to the Unitarian faith after one too many heresy trials. They brought Unitarianism to their native Czechoslovakia, a state newly formed and independent after the First World War. Through their ministry, the Unitarian Church in Prague, for the first time, became, for a while, one of the largest in the world. And it was there that Norbert developed the flower communion ceremony. Norbert initially sought a ritual to draw his community into a relationship with one another, but consistent with the Unitarian identity. By keying on nature's beauty, he asked each congregational member to bring a flower from their home garden, the roadside, or a field. At church, the flowers were assembled into vases, symbolizing their joining the congregation willingly. To our modern sensibilities, this bouquet also represents the beauty achieved by the range and variety of blooms, the diversity of flowers, and the variety of gifts each brings. Reverend Chapek would then invite each person to select a flower to take home with them, different from the one they brought, receiving the gifts of others. The ritual as a whole represents the worth and the human dignity of each person. Big success. So, an annual tradition. In 1940, Maya Chapek brought the ceremony to the Unitarian community in the United States. She had come here when the Nazi regime occupied Czechoslovakia, while Norbert stayed behind. These are events in 1938. Norbert was sent to the concentration camp Dachau, where he was murdered in 1942. But Maya only learned of his death at the end of the war. Just before his death, Norbert Chapek composed this prayer. It is worthwhile to live and fight courageously for sacred ideals. Oh, blow ye evil winds into my body's fire, my soul you'll never unravel. Even though disappointed 1,000 times or fallen in a fight and everything would worthless seem, I have lived amidst eternity. Be grateful, my soul. My life was worth living. He who was pressed from all sides but remained victorious in spirit is welcomed into the choir of heroes. He who overcame the fetters, giving wing to the mind, is entering into the golden age of the victorious. So we line up, pick a flower from another, a flower that speaks to us, enjoying Vera's interlude. And let us meditate on these words of Norbert Chapek. It is worthwhile to live and fight courageously for sacred ideals. Now that we're settled, join us in reading this responsive reading. It's in the order of service. I'll read what's in the plain font, and you all will read the italicized lines. From the original spirit of life, which implants in the seed the future of the tree, and in the hearts of people the longing for people living in human love.
More than the human world in which we move and which makes the parent and the sibling what they are.
In the name of sages and great religious leaders who sacrificed their lives to hasten the coming of peace and justice, let us renew our resolution sincerely to be interdependent, regardless of any kind of bar which estranges one from another.
In this holy resolution, may we be strengthened, knowing that we are interdependent, that one spirit unites us. May we endeavor for a more perfect and more joyful life.
Amen.
So now please join us. You can rise if you'd like, or you can stay seated if you'd like. We're going to sing hymn number 131 in the silver hymnals, which should be on your seats, and if not, grab one from the seat near you. And the words are in the order of service. They are by someone named Sally Rogers, and he will be playing the accompaniment for us. So we will start off giving us a little introduction, and then I'll give you a signal start.
We'd like to thank Reverend Kalen for your sermon today. I learned a lot. It was awesome. You clarified the richness of Universalism, the source in our UU's tradition. We thank you. We hope you come back. And thank you, all of you, for your wonderful floral contributions. The flower ceremony and its processions were so beautiful, and the meaning of the ceremony is especially heartfelt. As this wonderful flower ceremony brings us together to share our uniqueness, let us be reminded that while we can feel the significance in our hearts, we still need to account for the shared wood beneath our feet here at Oddfellows Hall. By making a donation to UUCC today, we can be assured that this location and these services will still be available to us to share with each other in the weeks to come. To donate by check, those instructions are in your order of service. The main thing is to make the check out to UUSM, UUs of San Mateo, while noting UUCC in the memo field. Let's take a few minutes to gather these papers, pause to catch our breath, and consider this community as it is today, and as it might blossom in the future for all of us to share. Blossom, see what I did there?
So, there is still time to write a check. But we now extinguish our candle flame. As we read together this chalice extinguishing, please consider how it relates today to today's flower ceremony. Join me in reading these words by Elizabeth Selly Jones. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts conclude with Reverend Kalen reading some words by John Murray.
Go out into the highways and byways. Give the people something of your new vision. You may possess a small light, but uncover it. Let it shine. Use it in order to bring more light and understanding to the hearts and minds of men and women. Give them not hell, but hope and courage. Preach the kindness and everlasting love of God. And now I would like to say, may we all be blessed, and may we all be a blessing for others. Amen.